Okay, so this is talking all about New York City back in 1869. The hint that they give us over here, as I read, I'm trying to look for details about what life was like in the city in 1869. So as I'm reading, I'm going to underline anything that I think is really interesting about life then. The close reading even says to find like what part of which sentence I like best in the first paragraph that's really capturing the life then, and I'm going to circle it. Okay. And then rereading the last paragraph when I get there. Okay. As John A. Rowling was designing his bridge in New York City, life was teetering between the old and new. What captured the state of life? It was teetering between the old and new. Perfect. And it says to circle it. I'm going to follow directions here and circle. Teetering between the old and new. They're already telling us New York and Brooklyn was a certain way. It was like old, and now it was becoming more new. No bridges existed between the two cities. Interesting. Travelers used one of 13 ferry boats that crossed. From the river, the spire of Trinity Church in New York was the tallest land ship to mark the ship. So basically they were all going by ship, but there was no bridges. So I'm just going to underline no bridges. No bridges, 13 ferry boats. Just to remind me, hey, there's no bridges. They were all going by boat. People mostly travel by horses and carriage on the ship. That's so interesting because it's hard to think about now that you would go on a ship, but with your horse and your carriage. The use of railroads and steamships was growing. Communication was by mail or telegraph. That's interesting. Telegraph is something, I don't know if you guys remember, but very interesting. There was a cable used to be able to send a telegraph. And in less than a decade, Alexander Graham Bell was about to invent the telephone. All over the world, new and amazing engineering feats were being accomplished. That's important to remember. Not necessarily about New York City, but there's amazing engineering feats happening that are going to affect New York City, like the canal, the longest railroad tunnel, and the Transcontinental Railroad. The idea of a bridge first gained support from civic leaders in Brooklyn. So in 1869, Brooklyn and New York were two separate cities that were independent. Brooklyn was the third largest. Brooklyn residents saw the bridge as a way to expand so that they could actually offer better access to New York markets. And New Yorkers saw the bridge as a way to relieve overcrowding. Thanks in part to how the Brooklyn Bridge created the first successful link between two cities, an expanding metropolis emerged. So, when they got together, they became almost like one big, large city. By 1898, the modern city of New York had 5 boroughs. So New York, when you think of New York now, you think of these 5 boroughs. And that was all created because of one bridge. Fascinating. Okay. So, which sentence best states our central idea? So some of them will be, they're giving us a hint over here. Some are just going to give like little tiny details, and that's not what they're asking. We want like an idea that is central to talking about New York City that encompasses all parts of New York City, not just, hey, like a little detail. Okay? Life in New York was teetering between the old and new. Yes, that kind of relates because they're talking about how people were traveling by horse and carriage, but then they were switching to mail and new things were coming, like the bridge. So I do think that's probably the best answer. But I'm going to check everything else. People once traveled by horse, carriage, and ship. See, that's the supporting detail that they're talking about, so we can cross that out. And then new engineering feats were being accomplished. Yes, but it's not exactly about New York, right? And this is about what is happening in just New York. Remember we mentioned that, like, oh, it's interesting, but it's not specific to New York, which is the whole title, New York, 1869. People crossed the East River by ferry boat day and night. That's a supporting detail. We need something that relates to the whole paragraph. First paragraph. Life in New York was teetering between old and new. Which detail best supports the idea that Brooklyn Bridge helped create modern-day New York? So how does this bridge help with New York? Does it support Brooklyn? Does it help ease overcrowding in New York? I mean, it did do both of those things. Did it successfully link the two independent cities? I mean, really, this is one, this is the other, and this supports both Brooklyn and New York. So out of those three options, you're going to want the one that talks about both Brooklyn and New York. And even though he decided to make travel easier, what really happened is that modern day New York is successful because they were linked. Not just because travel was easier, but both cities got linked together. Okay. Describe how the author connects the final paragraph to the paragraphs before it. So we need to just relook at that last paragraph. So the last paragraph, he's talking about how this bridge connects the residents and became a link to the different cities. Yeah, people supported the bridge on both sides because it helped both cities. Okay. The key ideas were in the first three paragraphs. So the key idea, remember, was what we chose right here. Life was teetering between the old and new. The author connects the idea that New York was teetering between old and new by using a bridge. The bridge was new technology, and the ferry was the old. Right? He's talking about old and new. Okay? And then it says, use two details from the text. The first detail was that it said the bridge would help Brooklyn, and it was saying Brooklyn to get into the New York markets. Now we have to think about how did it help New York City. If we remember. The second detail is that it helped New York City have less people and traffic. Okay, now how did these two details about the bridge really connect that New York was teetering between the old and new? We have to explain it. Okay, so the author connects the bridge showing it united the two cities just as New York was going from old to new and modern. Right? He's using the bridge almost like a metaphor for those of you who remember metaphors. The bridge is going from one spot to the other, just as New York is transitioning from old to new. Okay? And he brought that all together. Very, very well written piece. Okay? And then our next piece is going to be a brief history of Chapel Hill. We'll do that after this lesson.